The red Toyota Camry parked outside the Sunset Motel should have been just another car in my peripheral vision as I drove home from my shift at the accounting firm, but something about its familiar dent in the rear bumper made my stomach drop with a recognition that I desperately wanted to be wrong about. I pulled into the gas station across the street and stared through my windshield at the vehicle that looked exactly like my father's car, sitting in front of room 237 with its distinctive "World's Best Grandpa" bumper sticker that I had given him last Christmas, mocking me from 50 yards away. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found Dad and pressed call, my heart hammering against my ribs as I prayed that he would answer from the hospital where he had claimed to be spending the afternoon visiting my mother, who had been fighting what the doctors called complications from pneumonia for the past 3 weeks. "Catherine, sweetheart." His voice came through the speaker with the warm, familiar tone that had comforted me through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks, though now it sounded hollow and performed in a way that made my chest tighten with dread. "How was your day at work?" "Dad, where are you right now?" I asked, cutting through his casual small talk with the directness of someone who needed immediate confirmation that their worst suspicions were unfounded. "I'm here at the hospital keeping your mom company, just like I told you this morning," he replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone telling a truth so automatic that questioning it seemed absurd. "She's been sleeping most of the day, but the nurses say it's good for her to hear familiar voices even when she's not fully conscious." But as he spoke about my mother's peaceful sleep and the nurse's encouragement, I could hear something in the background that made my blood turn to ice in my veins, the soft, romantic melody of jazz music, the kind that played in intimate restaurant settings and hotel rooms, designed for couples seeking privacy, rather than hospital corridors filled with the beeping of medical equipment and the institutional sounds of healing. "That's good, Dad," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears as I stared at his car sitting motionless in the motel parking lot, while he described a scene that was supposedly taking place 15 miles away at St. Mary's Medical Center. "Tell Mom I love her when she wakes up." "Of course, sweetheart. She knows how much you care about her recovery," he had replied, and I could swear I heard a woman's laughter in the background, soft, musical, and definitely not coming from a woman who was unconscious in a hospital bed fighting for her life. I ended the call and sat in my car at the gas station, staring at my father's Toyota while my mind tried to process the implications of what I had just discovered. The man who had raised me to value honesty above all else, who had never missed a parent-teacher conference or forgotten an important birthday, who had cried when I graduated college and called me his greatest achievement, was sitting in a motel room lying to my face while my mother fought for her life alone in a hospital bed. The betrayal felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling my lungs, it was as if all the air was being sucked out of the world, leaving me gasping in a vacuum of disbelief and devastation that made my chest ache with physical pain. I drove my car to the far corner of the motel parking lot, positioned where I could see room 237, but where my own vehicle would be hidden behind a delivery truck that was making what appeared to be a lengthy stop. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there had to be some logical explanation for why my father's car was at a motel while he claimed to be at the hospital, but the emotional part of my mind was already constructing scenarios that would explain the romantic music and the woman's laughter that had accompanied his lies. 2 hours. I would wait 2 hours to see who emerged from that room, to understand what my father was doing while my mother lay dying, to confirm whether the man I had idolized my entire life was capable of the kind of betrayal that would change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. The afternoon sun beat down on my car as I sat in that parking lot, alternating between staring at room 237 and refreshing my phone to see if there were any updates from the hospital about my mother's condition, each minute feeling like an hour as I waited for answers that I was terrified to receive. At 4:47 p.m., the door to room 237 finally opened, and what I saw emerging into the fading daylight made my vision blur and my hands shake so violently that I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from collapsing entirely. My parents had always been the couple that other families aspired to emulate, the kind of partnership that made single people believe in the possibility of lasting love, and married couples feel inadequate about their own relationships. Robert and Margaret Chen had been together for 32 years, married for 29, and had navigated every challenge from financial struggles to my teenage rebellion with the kind of united front that made them seem invincible to the outside world, and absolutely unshakable to their daughter who had grown up believing that some marriages were simply too strong to fail. "Your parents are so lucky to have found each other," my friends would observe during high school gatherings at our house, watching my father surprise my mother with her favorite flowers for no particular reason, or seeing them slow dance in the kitchen while waiting for dinner to finish cooking, completely unself-conscious about displaying affection after decades of marriage. The affection had never seemed forced or performed for the benefit of observers. My parents genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company in ways that were both romantic and deeply friendly, sharing inside jokes that dated back to their college years and maintaining physical intimacy that had made me roll my eyes as a teenager, but had given me hope as an adult that real, lasting love was possible if you found the right person. Robert had been a high school math teacher for 26 years, beloved by students who appreciated his ability to make calculus accessible, and by colleagues who relied on his steady presence during budget cuts and administrative chaos. He coached the math team to state championships, volunteered for weekend tutoring programs, and had never missed a day of work except when I had chickenpox in 3rd grade and my mother was traveling for her job. Margaret had built a successful career as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, traveling throughout the Midwest to train new representatives and maintain relationships with major hospital systems. Her work required frequent overnight trips, but she had always arranged her schedule to be home for important family events, and had never let professional success interfere with her commitment to being present for the people she loved. "Balance is everything," she would tell me when I complained about how her travel schedule affected our family routines, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to excel professionally without sacrificing the relationships that gave her life meaning. "Success at work doesn't matter if you lose the people who make that success worth celebrating." Their marriage had weathered the normal challenges that test long-term partnerships. My father's brief unemployment when budget cuts eliminated teaching positions, my mother's difficult recovery from a car accident that had required months of physical therapy, and the stress of supporting my grandfather through his final illness while managing their own careers and parenting responsibilities. Through every challenge, they had presented a united front that made me feel secure in ways that I hadn't fully appreciated until I started dating and realized how rare it was to find someone who could be both a romantic partner and a reliable teammate through life's inevitable difficulties. "Marriage is work," my father would say when friends asked for relationship advice, his tone serious but not discouraging as he explained his philosophy about love requiring daily choices rather than just initial feelings. "But it's the kind of work that gets easier when you're with the right person, because you want to put in the effort to make them happy." The effort that both my parents put into making each other happy had been visible in countless small gestures that had shaped my understanding of what healthy relationships looked like. My father bringing my mother coffee in bed every morning before work. My mother recording my father's favorite TV shows when his teaching schedule conflicted with broadcast times, both of them actively listening to each other's workplace frustrations and offering support without trying to fix problems that just needed to be heard. Their example had made me optimistic about finding lasting love while also making me somewhat impatient with romantic partners who seemed to treat relationships as entertainment rather than commitment, who wanted the benefits of partnership without the responsibility of being genuinely supportive during difficult times. "You have high standards because you've seen what good marriage looks like," my mother had observed when I ended yet another relationship with someone who expected me to be perpetually agreeable without offering the same consideration in return. "Don't settle for less than what you know is possible." The possibility that my mother had shown me through her marriage to my father had included weathering serious challenges together rather than abandoning each other when life became difficult, which was why the current situation felt so incomprehensible and devastating. My mother's sudden illness had come without warning, a routine case of pneumonia that had somehow developed complications requiring hospitalization and intensive monitoring. My father had seemed appropriately concerned and devoted, visiting the hospital daily and keeping me updated on her condition with the kind of detailed medical information that suggested he was deeply engaged with her care. Now, sitting in a motel parking lot watching my father's car, I was forced to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my parents' marriage and my father's character, wondering how long he had been capable of deception and whether my entire understanding of my family had been built on lies. My mother's pneumonia had started as what seemed like a routine case of seasonal flu that she had picked up during one of her business trips to Chicago, where she had been training a new team of pharmaceutical sales representatives in the frigid January weather that always seemed to breed respiratory infections among travelers who weren't accustomed to Midwest winters. "I think I caught something from the airport," she had mentioned casually during our weekly phone call, her voice slightly hoarse, but not concerning enough to suggest anything more serious than the kind of minor illness that busy adults power through with rest and over-the-counter medications. "You know how those planes are just flying petri dishes during flu season?" The flying petri dishes comment had been typical of my mother's practical approach to health issues, acknowledging problems without dramatizing them, taking reasonable precautions without becoming paranoid about every symptom that might indicate something serious. She had always been the family member who remained calm during medical crises, researching treatment options and asking intelligent questions while my father and I tended toward anxiety and worst-case scenario thinking. "Make sure you're getting enough rest," I had advised with the kind of concerned but not alarmed tone that adult children use when their healthy parents report minor ailments, assuming that someone who had successfully managed her health for 54 years could handle a simple respiratory infection without needing extensive monitoring or intervention. But the simple respiratory infection had progressed over the following week into something that required my mother to take time off work for the first time in years, then progressed further into the kind of persistent cough and fatigue that had prompted my father to insist she see her primary care physician for evaluation and possible antibiotic treatment. "The doctor says it's pneumonia," my father had reported after accompanying my mother to her appointment, his voice carrying the kind of controlled concern that suggested he was trying not to alarm me, while also conveying that the situation was more serious than we had initially realized. "She's going to need antibiotics and rest, but it should clear up with proper treatment." The proper treatment had seemed to be working initially. My mother's cough had improved, her energy had returned enough for her to return to work part-time, and the family had collectively relaxed as it became clear that the illness was responding to medical intervention rather than developing into something more dangerous. But 3 weeks later, my mother had experienced what the doctors called complications that had required emergency hospitalization and intensive monitoring that transformed a routine illness into a life-threatening medical crisis that none of us had seen coming. Her oxygen levels dropped suddenly, my father had explained during the panicked phone call that had brought me rushing to the hospital at 2 a.m, his voice shaking with fear and exhaustion as he described the frightening sequence of events that had led to my mother being admitted to the intensive care unit. She was having trouble breathing, and when we got to the emergency room, they said her lungs were filled with fluid. The fluid in her lungs had required immediate treatment to prevent respiratory failure, followed by a series of tests and procedures designed to understand why my mother's immune system had been unable to fight off an infection that should have responded to standard antibiotic therapy. Sometimes pneumonia can be more aggressive in people who are under stress or whose immune systems are compromised, the attending physician had explained to my father and me during one of our early hospital visits, his tone professional but compassionate as he outlined the treatment plan that would hopefully restore my mother's breathing to normal levels. The stress that might have compromised my mother's immune system had been attributed to her demanding work schedule, the recent loss of her older brother to cancer, and the general health anxiety that had been affecting our entire family since my grandfather's death the previous year had reminded us all of our own mortality. "She's been pushing herself too hard," my father had said, with the kind of guilty self-recrimination that spouses feel when their partner's illness forces them to recognize that they should have been more attentive to signs of exhaustion or stress that had been accumulating over time. The pushing herself too hard explanation had seemed reasonable, given my mother's tendency to prioritize other people's needs over her own self-care, her commitment to excellence in her professional responsibilities, and her desire to be available for family members who had been dealing with their own challenges and setbacks. Over the following weeks, my mother's condition had stabilized, but not improved as quickly as the medical team had hoped, requiring continued hospitalization and treatments that kept her sedated for much of the day, while her body fought to recover from an infection that had proved more resilient than anyone had anticipated. "She's getting the best possible care," my father had assured me during his daily updates about her condition, his voice carrying the kind of grateful confidence that families feel when they trust their medical team and believe that professional expertise will ultimately restore their loved one to health. Now, sitting in a motel parking lot while my father claimed to be at the hospital, I was beginning to wonder whether my mother's illness was as serious as we had been told, or whether there were aspects of her condition that had been misrepresented to me for reasons I couldn't yet understand. The inconsistencies in my father's behavior had been subtle at first, small deviations from his normal patterns that I had attributed to the stress of managing my mother's illness while maintaining his teaching responsibilities and trying to provide emotional support for a family dealing with an unexpected medical crisis that had disrupted all our assumptions about health and stability. Robert had always been a creature of habit whose daily routines provided structure for our family's life. Breakfast at exactly 6:30 a.m., departure for school at 7:45 a.m., evening news at 6 p.m., followed by dinner preparation that had been a shared activity for my parents since they were newlyweds, learning to coordinate their domestic responsibilities with their professional obligations. But since my mother's hospitalization, my father's schedule had become erratic in ways that seemed disproportionate to the demands of visiting hours and medical appointments that should have been manageable for someone who had been balancing work and family responsibilities successfully for decades. "I won't be able to have dinner tonight," had become his standard excuse for declining my invitations to share meals that might provide comfort and family connection during a difficult time, his explanations always involving hospital visits that seemed to require more time than actual visiting hours would allow. The hospital visits that supposedly consumed most of my father's free time had been described in vague terms that lacked the specific details I would have expected from someone who was genuinely spending hours each day in medical facilities observing his wife's treatment and communicating with healthcare providers about her progress. "How is Mom doing today?" I would ask during our daily phone calls, expecting detailed updates about her breathing, her response to medications, her interactions with nurses, or her general mood and energy levels. "She's about the same," my father would reply with the kind of generic assessment that could apply to any hospital patient, rather than the specific observations that would come from someone who was actually present for his wife's daily medical care and recovery process. The lack of specific details had been puzzling, but not alarming initially, since I assumed that my father was trying to shield me from medical information that might be frightening or overwhelming for someone who wasn't present to observe my mother's condition firsthand. But other aspects of his behavior had been more difficult to explain away as protective instincts or stress-related changes in normal family communication patterns. My father's appearance had improved rather than deteriorated during the weeks of my mother's illness, which seemed counterintuitive for someone who was supposedly spending sleepless nights in hospital waiting rooms and managing the emotional strain of watching his wife fight for her life. "Dad, you look really good," I had observed during one of our brief meetings at a coffee shop near the hospital, noting that his complexion was healthier and his general demeanor more energetic than I would have expected from someone dealing with a family medical crisis. "I've been trying to take care of myself so I can be strong for your mother," he had replied with the kind of responsible self-care messaging that sounded appropriate, but felt somehow rehearsed rather than authentic. The taking care of himself had apparently included new clothes that I didn't recognize, a cologne that he had never worn during my childhood, and a general attention to personal grooming that seemed more consistent with someone who was trying to make good impressions rather than someone whose primary focus was supporting his hospitalized wife. My father's phone habits had also changed in ways that created distance, rather than the increased communication I would have expected during a family crisis that required coordination and mutual support. "I'll call you back later," had become his standard response to my calls, even when I was reaching out during times that should have been convenient for conversation. And his return calls often came hours later with explanations about hospital procedures or medical consultations that had prevented immediate communication. The delayed communication had been accompanied by background noise that didn't sound like hospital environments, music, conversation, and general ambient sounds that seemed more consistent with restaurants or social gatherings than medical facilities where patients required quiet environments for rest and recovery. "Where are you calling from?" I had asked during one conversation where the background noise made it difficult to hear his voice clearly. "Just stepping outside for some fresh air," he had replied quickly, though the sounds I could hear suggested indoor spaces rather than hospital parking lots or outdoor areas where people typically went to escape institutional environments. The fresh air excuse had been used multiple times to explain phone calls that took place in locations that didn't sound like any hospital I had ever visited, creating a pattern of explanations that seemed designed to avoid providing specific information about his actual whereabouts during the hours he claimed to be devoted to my mother's care. Looking back from the motel parking lot where I was now waiting to discover the truth about my father's activities, I could see that the strange behaviors I had been dismissing as stress-related changes were actually evidence of deception that had been carefully maintained over weeks of lies about his daily activities and genuine priorities. My attempts to visit my mother during her hospitalization had been met with a series of obstacles and scheduling conflicts that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared to be part of a deliberate strategy to prevent me from discovering something that my father didn't want me to see or understand about my mother's actual condition. The doctors are limiting visitors while they adjust her medications, my father had explained when I called to arrange my first visit after my mother's emergency admission, his voice carrying the kind of medical authority that parents use when they want to protect their adult children from stressful healthcare decisions that seem too complex for non-medical family members to understand. The medication adjustment explanation had been followed by updates about treatment protocols that required my mother to rest without stimulation, respiratory therapy sessions that coincided with traditional visiting hours, and infection control procedures that restricted access to immediate family members who had been designated as primary caregivers. I'm immediate family too, I had protested when my father suggested that my presence might interfere with my mother's recovery process, my voice carrying frustration at being excluded from medical decisions and bedside support that should have been shared family responsibilities. Of course you are, sweetheart, my father had replied with reassuring warmth that was supposed to address my concerns without actually resolving the practical problem of when I would be allowed to see my mother and participate in her care. I just want to make sure we're following the medical team's recommendations exactly so she can recover as quickly as possible. The medical team's recommendations had apparently required my father to serve as the sole liaison between my mother and the outside world, receiving updates from doctors and nurses that he would then summarize for me during our daily phone calls, rather than allowing me to communicate directly with healthcare providers or observe my mother's condition firsthand. What did the doctor say about her breathing today? I would ask, hoping for specific medical information that would help me understand the progression of her treatment and recovery timeline. He's encouraged by her response to the new medications, my father would reply with optimistic assessments that lacked the clinical details I craved as someone who needed concrete information to process my anxiety about my mother's health and prognosis. The encouraged doctor's assessments had been supplemented by my father's descriptions of my mother's daily activities and mood, though these reports had been frustratingly vague and inconsistent with what I would have expected from someone who was spending hours each day observing his wife's medical care. She asked about you, my father would report during calls that were supposed to provide connection between my mother and me during her recovery, though these messages were always general expressions of love rather than the specific questions or comments that would indicate genuine communication between a hospitalized mother and her concerned daughter. The messages from my mother had never included requests for me to visit, specific information about her experience in the hospital, or personal details that would suggest she was actually conscious and alert enough to engage in meaningful conversation with my father during his supposed visits. When I had finally insisted on visiting regardless of medical recommendations or scheduling conflicts, my father had agreed to arrange a brief visit that would be carefully timed to avoid interfering with treatments or procedures that required my mother to remain undisturbed. Sunday afternoon should work well, he had said, after consulting with medical staff about the best time for family visits that wouldn't compromise my mother's recovery or create problems for the nursing staff who were managing her complex treatment requirements. The Sunday afternoon visit had been scheduled for 2 p.m. at St. Mary's Medical Center, where my father had been providing me with updates about my mother's location and care for the previous 3 weeks of her hospitalization. But when I had arrived at the hospital information desk to get directions to my mother's room, the volunteer who was supposed to help me locate patients had been unable to find any record of Margaret Chen being admitted to their facility. "Are you sure about the spelling?" the elderly volunteer had asked, while searching through computer records that should have shown my mother's room assignment and visiting restrictions, her confusion matching my own growing panic about what might have happened to my mother's medical care. Maybe she was transferred to another hospital, I had suggested, trying to find logical explanations for why my mother couldn't be located in the facility where my father had been visiting her daily for weeks. The hospital administrator who had been called to resolve the confusion had been professionally sympathetic, but unable to provide any information about Margaret Chen's admission, treatment, or possible transfer to other medical facilities in the area. "Perhaps there's been some miscommunication about which hospital your mother is staying at," she had suggested with the diplomatic tact that healthcare professionals use when family members appear to have incorrect information about their loved one's medical care. Standing in that hospital lobby, unable to find any trace of my mother in the facility where my father claimed to be visiting her daily, I had felt the first serious doubts about whether anything my father had been telling me about my mother's illness was actually true. The drive home from St. Mary's medical center had been a blur of confusion and growing panic as I tried to process the implications of my mother's apparent absence from the hospital, where my father had been claiming to visit her daily for 3 weeks, my mind racing through increasingly disturbing possibilities about what might really be happening to my family. My first instinct had been to call my father immediately and demand an explanation for why I couldn't locate my mother at the hospital, but something had held me back from confronting him directly. Perhaps a survival instinct that warned me I needed more information before I could safely navigate whatever deception was being maintained at my expense. Instead, I had driven to the 3 other major hospitals in our metropolitan area, spending the afternoon visiting information desks and patient location services to determine whether my mother had been transferred between facilities without my knowledge or whether she was receiving treatment under different circumstances than I had been told. The search through Methodist General, University Hospital, and Regional Medical Center had yielded the same results as my visit to St. Mary's. No record of Margaret Chen being admitted for pneumonia treatment or any other medical condition during the time frame when my father had been reporting daily updates about her hospitalization and recovery progress. "Are you sure about the dates?" had been the consistent question from hospital staff, who were trying to help me locate a patient who appeared to exist only in my father's descriptions of his daily hospital visits and conversations with medical professionals. The certainty about dates had been absolute. My mother's emergency admission had been exactly 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday night, when my father had called me in panic about her breathing difficulties and need for immediate medical intervention. The timeline had been reinforced by daily phone calls, providing updates about her condition and treatment that had created a detailed narrative of illness and recovery that was apparently completely fictional. Back at my apartment, I had spread out my calendar and began reconstructing the timeline of my mother's supposed illness, looking for inconsistencies or clues that might explain the discrepancy between my father's reports and the complete absence of any hospital records confirming those reports. The reconstruction had revealed several troubling patterns that I had been too focused on my mother's health to notice while they were occurring, but which now seemed like evidence of systematic deception rather than stress-related communication difficulties. My father's descriptions of my mother's medical team had never included specific names of doctors, nurses, or other healthcare providers who would typically be part of a pneumonia patient's treatment team. His updates about her condition had been generic enough to apply to any hospitalized patient, rather than containing the specific medical details that would come from someone who was actually observing daily treatments and procedures. The visiting restrictions that had prevented me from seeing my mother had been unusually extensive and had lasted far longer than would be typical for pneumonia patients who were stable enough to receive daily visits from their spouse. Most concerning, my father had never mentioned other family members or friends asking about my mother's condition, which seemed unlikely, given her extensive social network of colleagues and neighbors who would normally be offering support during a serious illness. I had decided to test my growing suspicions by calling my mother's workplace to ask about her medical leave and whether any of her colleagues had been in contact with her during her hospitalization. "Margaret's been out for a few weeks with family matters," her supervisor had confirmed when I reached the pharmaceutical company's regional office, though the description of family matters rather than medical leave had created new questions about what my mother was actually dealing with during her absence from work. "Family matters?" I had asked, hoping for clarification that might explain why my mother's illness was being characterized differently by her employer than by my father. She didn't provide specific details, but she said she needed time to handle some personal situations that required her full attention. The supervisor had replied, with the kind of diplomatic vagueness that suggested my mother had been deliberately unclear about her reasons for taking extended time off from work. The personal situations that required my mother's full attention were apparently different from the life-threatening pneumonia that had supposedly required 3 weeks of intensive medical care, creating another layer of confusion about what was actually happening in my family. That evening, I had made a decision that felt like crossing a line, but seemed necessary, given the accumulating evidence that nothing I had been told about my mother's condition was accurate. I would conduct my own investigation into my father's activities and my mother's actual whereabouts, starting with the kind of basic surveillance that would either confirm my worst fears or provide logical explanations for the discrepancies I had discovered. The investigation had led me to follow my father's car, which had brought me to the Sunset Motel, where everything I thought I knew about my family was about to be destroyed by whatever truth was waiting behind the door of room 237. The 2 hours I spent sitting in that motel parking lot became a crash course in questioning every assumption I had ever made about my family, as my mind cycled through increasingly disturbing possibilities about what my father might be doing while claiming to care for my hospitalized mother, who apparently didn't exist in any medical facility I could locate. The most obvious explanation was the one that had initially brought me to this parking lot. My father was having an affair with another woman, while my mother fought for her life alone in some hospital that I hadn't been able to find. This interpretation of events painted my father as a man whose character I had completely misjudged, someone capable of abandoning his wife during her greatest need to pursue romantic gratification with a stranger who didn't know or care about his family obligations. But as I sat watching Room 237 and replaying every conversation I had had with my father over the past 3 weeks, I began to realize that the affair explanation, while devastating, might not account for all the inconsistencies I had discovered during my search for my mother's actual location and medical care. If my mother was genuinely hospitalized somewhere, my father's lies about which facility she was staying at would be cruel but comprehensible as the deception of a man trying to compartmentalize his guilt about infidelity. But the complete absence of any hospital records suggesting my mother had been admitted anywhere for pneumonia treatment implied a much more complex deception that involved not just my father's romantic choices, but the fundamental facts about my mother's health and whereabouts. The alternative explanations that occurred to me during those 2 hours were so disturbing that I tried to dismiss them as paranoid fantasies, but they kept returning with increasing plausibility as I examined the evidence I had accumulated. What if my mother wasn't sick at all? What if the entire pneumonia story had been fabricated to explain her absence from normal family life, while she dealt with some other crisis that my father felt I couldn't handle knowing about? The family matters that her supervisor had mentioned could involve anything from financial problems to legal issues to personal struggles that my parents had decided to shield me from through an elaborate medical fiction. Or what if my mother was sick, but not with pneumonia, and not in a way that could be treated in traditional medical facilities? What if she was dealing with mental health issues, addiction problems, or other conditions that required specialized care in facilities that wouldn't appear in normal hospital patient directories? The worst possibility that I couldn't stop my mind from exploring was that something had happened to my mother. An accident, a crime, a family emergency, that my father was trying to handle without involving me, either to protect me from trauma or to buy time while he figured out how to resolve a situation that he couldn't fix through normal channels. Each of these scenarios would explain why my father had been lying about my mother's location, while providing enough truth about her absence from normal life to maintain the deception over an extended period. They would also explain why he had been preventing me from visiting her directly, since any face-to-face contact would have exposed whatever was really happening. But none of these explanations accounted for the romantic music I had heard in the background during my father's phone call from the motel room, or the woman's laughter that had accompanied his claims about being at the hospital. Those details suggested that whatever deception was being maintained about my mother's situation, it also involved my father's relationship with another woman, who was apparently part of whatever secret he was keeping. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, I found myself hoping that the simple affair explanation would turn out to be accurate, because that scenario, while personally devastating, would at least mean that my mother was alive and receiving medical care somewhere, even if my father had abandoned his responsibilities to pursue his own desires. The alternatives were too frightening to fully contemplate: that my mother had disappeared, that she was in danger, that my father was somehow responsible for her absence, or that my entire family was built on lies that went far deeper than infidelity and extended into questions about basic safety and survival. At 4:45 p.m., I saw movement in the curtains of room 237, shadows indicating that the occupants were preparing to leave. My heart began racing as I realized that within minutes, I would finally see who my father had been meeting while claiming to care for my mother, and that whatever I discovered would change my understanding of my family forever. The truth I was about to witness would either confirm my worst fears about my father's character, or reveal something even more shocking about the secrets that had been hidden from me for reasons I couldn't yet imagine. Those 2 hours in the motel parking lot stretched like an eternity, each minute crawling by with the weight of impending revelation, while I alternated between staring at room 237 and checking my phone for messages that might provide some explanation for the nightmare my life was becoming. The afternoon heat made my car feel like an oven, but I was afraid to start the engine and risk drawing attention to my surveillance, so I sat sweating in the suffocating air while my mind raced through every possible scenario that might explain what I was about to witness. My phone buzzed occasionally with work emails and text messages from friends, normal communications from a normal life that seemed to belong to someone else now that I was sitting in a parking lot spying on my father and questioning everything I had ever believed about my family's honesty and integrity. The mundane concerns of deadlines and social plans felt absurd against the backdrop of the family crisis that was unfolding around me like a slow-motion car accident that I was powerless to prevent. At 3:30 p.m., I had called my father again, hoping that he might provide some clue about his actual location or the time frame for his return from whatever activities were keeping him at the motel instead of the hospital where he claimed to be spending his afternoon. "How's Mom doing?" I had asked when he answered, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears as I attempted to maintain normal family conversation while watching his car sitting motionless in front of the room where he was supposedly not present. "She's been sleeping most of the day," he had replied with the same generic medical update that had become his standard response to my inquiries about my mother's condition, though this time I could hear different background music than what I had noticed during our earlier conversation, something that sounded like classical piano rather than romantic jazz. "Are you still at the hospital?" I had asked directly, testing whether he would maintain his lie when given an explicit opportunity to provide accurate information about his whereabouts. "Yes, I'm just reading in the visitor's lounge while she rests," he had answered without hesitation, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone telling a truth so obvious that questioning it seemed unnecessary, even though I was staring at his car and knew that he was lying to my face with practiced ease. The reading in the visitor's lounge explanation had been delivered with enough specific detail to sound credible, though the classical piano music I could hear in the background didn't match any hospital environment I had ever experienced during my own visits to medical facilities. After ending that call, I had spent another hour constructing and discarding theories about what my father might be doing that would require both his presence at a motel and his elaborate deception about being elsewhere. The possibilities ranged from relatively innocent explanations involving privacy needs that he felt couldn't be shared with his daughter, to catastrophic scenarios involving criminal activity or family dangers that would explain his need for secrecy. The family dangers that my imagination kept returning to included situations where my mother had become involved in something that threatened her safety, financial fraud, legal problems, or personal relationships that had created risks requiring her to disappear from normal life, while my father tried to resolve the crisis through channels that couldn't involve traditional authorities. But every attempt to construct innocent explanations for my father's behavior was undermined by the reality that he was meeting with another woman in a motel room, while lying to me about being at a hospital, caring for my supposedly critically ill mother. Whatever crisis my family was facing, it involved romantic or sexual activities that made my father's deception more personal and more devastating than simple family protection. The romantic activities that I couldn't stop imagining were making me physically sick, with a combination of betrayal, anger, and confusion about how the man who had raised me to value honesty and loyalty could be capable of such systematic deception during what was supposed to be a medical emergency requiring family unity and mutual support. At 4:30 p.m., I had seen the curtains in room 237 move slightly, suggesting that the occupants were aware of their surroundings and possibly preparing for departure. My pulse had quickened as I realized that my long wait was almost over, and that within minutes I would have answers to questions that would either destroy my family or provide explanations that might allow us to move forward with some version of truth and trust. The answers I was about to receive would either confirm that my father was having an affair while my mother faced a medical crisis alone, or reveal something even more shocking about the secrets that had been hidden from me while I lived in ignorance about my family's actual circumstances. At 4:47 p.m., the door to room 237 finally opened, and the first person to emerge into the late afternoon sunlight was my father, looking relaxed and satisfied in a way that made my stomach clench with revulsion and disappointment in the man I had idolized my entire life. But what I saw next made my vision blur, and my hands shake so violently that I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from falling apart completely. The woman who emerged from room 237 behind my father was not a stranger, not some anonymous temptress who had seduced him away from his family obligations, but someone whose appearance made my world tilt sideways as every assumption I had ever made about my family's history and my own identity crumbled into dust before my eyes. She looked exactly like my mother, not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in ways that seemed to defy the laws of genetics and probability. The same height, the same build, the same way of moving through space with elegant confidence that had always made my mother stand out in crowds. Her hair was the same rich brown color as my mother's, cut in the same style that had remained fashionable for decades, framing a face that was so familiar, I felt like I was looking at my mother through a time machine that had erased 20 years of aging. But this woman was younger, noticeably, unmistakably younger, with skin that held the firmness of someone in her early 30s, rather than the soft lines that had been developing around my mother's eyes and mouth as she approached her 55th birthday. She wore clothes that were stylish and expensive, the kind of outfit my mother might choose for important business meetings or social events where she wanted to make a strong impression. As I watched in stunned disbelief, this woman who looked like a younger version of my mother walked to my father's car with the casual familiarity of someone who had made this journey many times before. She carried herself with confidence and grace, moving like someone who belonged in this scenario rather than someone who was hiding or ashamed of her presence in my father's life. My father opened the passenger door for her with the kind of gentlemanly courtesy that he had always shown my mother, though there was an energy between them that seemed more romantic and passionate than the comfortable companionship that had characterized my parents' marriage after 3 decades together. They stood beside the car talking quietly for several minutes, their body language intimate and relaxed in a way that suggested deep familiarity and mutual affection. The woman reached up to straighten my father's collar, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead with a tenderness that made my chest ache with the recognition that this was not a casual affair, but a significant relationship that had been developing over time. As they prepared to get into the car, the woman turned in my direction, and for a moment I thought she was looking directly at me through my windshield 50 yards away. The sight of her face in full profile confirmed what I had begun to suspect, but couldn't quite accept. This woman was not just similar to my mother. She was identical to my mother except for the 20-year age difference that made her appearance impossible to reconcile with everything I knew about my family's history. My mind raced through explanations that might account for what I was witnessing. Could my mother have a twin sister that I had never been told about? Could this be some kind of elaborate identity theft involving someone who had undergone plastic surgery to look like my mother? Could my mother herself have found some way to reverse the aging process? Or was I having some kind of psychological breakdown that was making me see things that couldn't possibly exist? But as I watched my father and this mysterious woman drive away from the motel, the explanation that seemed most plausible was also the most disturbing. This woman was related to my mother in ways that had been hidden from me my entire life, and my father's relationship with her was connected to family secrets that went far deeper than a simple extramarital affair. The possibility that began to crystallize in my mind as I sat alone in the parking lot was that this woman might be my mother's daughter from a previous relationship, my half-sister, whose existence had been concealed from me for reasons that were now becoming horrifyingly clear through my father's current behavior. If my mother had given birth to a daughter before marrying my father, and if that daughter had been raised by other people, or given up for adoption, her return to my mother's life could explain the family matters that had required my mother to take leave from work, the secrecy that had surrounded my mother's recent activities, and my father's elaborate deception about her whereabouts. But it wouldn't explain why my father was having a romantic relationship with this woman who appeared to be my sister, or why my mother was allowing this relationship to continue while maintaining the fiction that she was hospitalized with pneumonia. As I drove home from the motel parking lot, my hands shaking and my vision blurred with tears, I realized that the truth about my family was going to be even more devastating than anything I had imagined during those 2 hours of waiting for answers that had raised more questions than they had resolved. The woman I had seen with my father was either my mother's identical twin, my half-sister, or someone whose connection to my family involved secrets so profound that discovering them was going to destroy everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the people who had raised me. The confrontation with my father came 3 days later, after I had spent 72 hours in a state of emotional suspension, unable to eat or sleep while my mind cycled through increasingly disturbing theories about the woman I had seen at the motel and her connection to my family's hidden history. I had called in sick to work, ignored messages from friends, and spent entire nights staring at the ceiling while trying to construct scenarios that might explain what I had witnessed without destroying my fundamental beliefs about my parents' character and our family's integrity. When I finally worked up the courage to demand answers, I had driven to my father's house, the house where I had grown up believing in the stability of my parents' marriage and the honesty of their communication with me, and had found him in the kitchen preparing dinner for one, a detail that seemed to confirm that my mother was not merely away at some hospital, but was absent from their shared life in ways that had been concealed from me through weeks of elaborate deception. "Catherine," he had said when I walked through the door using the key I had never returned after moving out for college, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked like relief, as he realized that the charade he had been maintaining was finally coming to an end. "I've been expecting you." The admission that he had been expecting me suggested that he had known his deception would eventually be discovered, and perhaps that he had been waiting for this confrontation, rather than dreading it as I had assumed during my days of agonized speculation about how to approach him with questions that might destroy our relationship forever. "Where is my mother?" I had asked without preamble, my voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from being lied to systematically by someone whose honesty you had never questioned before. "And who was that woman I saw you with at the motel?" The questions had been direct enough to prevent evasion or further deception, though I had been prepared for my father to continue lying, even when confronted with evidence of his activities that couldn't be explained away through innocent explanations or misunderstandings. Instead, my father had sat down heavily at the kitchen table where our family had shared thousands of meals, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a burden that was too heavy to manage alone any longer. "Your mother isn't sick," he had said quietly, his voice carrying the relief of someone finally telling the truth, after weeks of maintaining lies that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. "She's been staying with her daughter, your half-sister Sarah, while we figured out how to tell you about a family situation that we should have explained to you years ago. The half-sister whose existence I had suspected but hadn't been able to accept was apparently real, though the revelation that my mother had been staying with her, rather than being hospitalized with pneumonia, created new questions about why this family reunion had required such elaborate deception and secrecy. Sarah is your mother's daughter from a relationship she had before we met," my father had continued, apparently recognizing that I needed complete honesty, rather than partial explanations that might leave room for further doubt or confusion. "Your mother was 17 when Sarah was born, and the circumstances of that pregnancy were complicated. Sarah was adopted by a family in another state, and your mother never expected to see her again. The complicated circumstances that had led to my mother giving up a daughter for adoption had apparently been resolved recently when Sarah had reached out to establish contact with her biological mother, creating a family crisis that my parents had felt unable to share with me while they navigated the emotional and practical challenges of integrating a previously unknown family member into their lives. Sarah contacted your mother 6 months ago," my father had explained, his voice growing stronger as he provided details that began to make the recent deception comprehensible rather than merely devastating. "She had been searching for her biological family for years, and when she finally found your mother, she was dealing with some personal problems that required family support and assistance. The personal problems that had required family support had included financial difficulties, relationship issues, and health concerns that had made Sarah's outreach to her biological mother more urgent than a simple desire to satisfy curiosity about her genetic heritage. Your mother felt responsible for helping Sarah through these difficulties," my father had continued, "but she was afraid that introducing a half-sister you had never known about would disrupt your life and create family complications that might be more harmful than helpful. The family complications that my parents had been trying to avoid through secrecy had instead been created by the deception itself, as their elaborate lies about my mother's illness had generated exactly the kind of crisis and mistrust that honest communication might have prevented. "What about the motel?" I had asked, still unable to reconcile my father's romantic behavior with this explanation about family obligations and protective deception. My father's face had reddened with embarrassment as he prepared to explain the most disturbing aspect of the situation I had discovered. "Sarah looks exactly like your mother did when we first met," he had said quietly, "and I'm ashamed to admit that spending time with her has made me feel confused about feelings I thought I had resolved decades ago." The truth was more complex and more disturbing than simple infidelity. My father had developed romantic feelings for my half-sister, who looked like a younger version of my mother, creating a family crisis that involved not just deception, but emotional betrayal that threatened every relationship that mattered to me.